Lady Victoria Ashworth had always prided herself on her impeccable reputation. As the wife of Duke Edmund Ashworth and a prominent figure in the fictional kingdom of Valdoria's high society, she commanded respect wherever she went. But, on this cold November evening at Heathrow Airport, her world was about to crumble in the most spectacular fashion imaginable. The private jet terminal buzzed with its usual quiet efficiency. Wealthy passengers moved through security with the ease that money could buy, their expensive luggage handled with white-gloved care. Victoria adjusted her Hermes scarf and checked her Cartier watch for the third time in 5 minutes. Flight VA 447 to Geneva was scheduled to depart at 11:30 p.m., and she had precisely 47 minutes to clear customs and board. Detective Inspector Sarah Chun of the Metropolitan Police's Art and Antiquities Unit had been tracking suspicious activity for weeks. Intelligence suggested that priceless artifacts from Valdoria's crown estate were being systematically smuggled out of the country. The operation was sophisticated, involving someone with intimate knowledge of the royal collection and access to the highest levels of society. Chun positioned herself strategically near the customs checkpoint, her trained eyes scanning the well-dressed passengers. She had studied hundreds of photographs and case files, memorizing the faces of those with both motive and opportunity. When Lady Victoria approached the security scanner, something in her demeanor triggered Chin's instincts. The woman's confident facade couldn't quite mask the tension in her shoulders or the way her fingers drummed nervously against her designer handbag. The X-ray machine operator, Officer James Mitchell, had 20 years of experience reading suspicious luggage. When Lady Victoria's Louis Vuitton case passed through the scanner, he immediately noticed unusual density patterns. The digital image showed what appeared to be carefully wrapped objects nested within layers of clothing and personal items. The shapes were irregular, ornate, and far too dense to be costume jewelry or personal accessories. "Ma'am, we'll need to conduct a manual inspection of your luggage," Officer Mitchell announced with professional courtesy. Lady Victoria's smile never wavered, but Chin noticed the almost imperceptible tightening around her eyes. "Of course, officer. Though I do hope this won't take long. I have a rather important engagement in Switzerland tomorrow morning." As Mitchell opened the suitcase, the terminal seemed to hold its breath. Beneath layers of silk scarves and cashmere sweaters, wrapped in museum-quality protective cloth, lay a collection that made even the experienced customs officers gasp. A diamond-encrusted tiara caught the fluorescent lights, throwing rainbow patterns across the inspection table. Beside it, an emerald necklace that belonged in a royal treasury gleamed with impossible fire. Ancient rings, ceremonial brooches, and a golden scepter head completed the breathtaking display. Detective Inspector Chin stepped forward, her badge already in hand. "Lady Victoria Ashworth, I'm placing you under arrest on suspicion of theft and illegal exportation of national treasures. You have the right to remain silent." The arrest sent shockwaves through the terminal. Other passengers stopped to stare as Lady Victoria, still maintaining her composure despite the handcuffs, was led away by security. The jewelry, worth an estimated £15 million, was carefully photographed and secured as evidence. Within hours, the story had broken across every major news outlet in Valdoria and beyond. "Duchess caught with crown jewels," screamed the headlines. Social media exploded with theories, accusations, and wild speculation about how someone so close to the royal family could have orchestrated such an audacious theft. But, as Detective Inspector Chun would soon discover, Lady Victoria's arrest was only the beginning. The investigation that followed would uncover a web of corruption, betrayal, and secrets that reached the very heart of Valdoria's monarchy. The woman sitting in the detention cell, still wearing her Chanel suit and pearls, held the key to a conspiracy that threatened to bring down the crown itself. The real question wasn't whether Lady Victoria was guilty. The evidence was overwhelming. The question was whether she was the mastermind or merely another victim in a game far more dangerous than anyone could have imagined. And, as Chin prepared for the interrogation that would define her career, she couldn't shake the feeling that she had just arrested either the kingdom's most cunning criminal or its most tragic scapegoat. The interrogation room at New Scotland Yard felt smaller than its actual dimensions, its gray walls seeming to close in as Detective Inspector Sarah Chun faced Lady Victoria Ashworth across a metal table. Despite spending the night in custody, Victoria maintained an almost supernatural composure, her designer clothes wrinkled but her dignity intact. Chin had conducted hundreds of interviews with suspects from all walks of life, but rarely had she encountered someone who radiated such conflicted energy. Victoria's hands, elegantly manicured despite the circumstances, trembled slightly when she thought no one was looking. Her eyes, a striking blue that had graced society pages for decades, held depths that suggested she was wrestling with demons far more complex than simple guilt or innocence. The jewelry found in your possession, Chin began, spreading high-resolution photographs across the table, includes pieces that have been part of Valdoria's crown estate for over 3 centuries. The Empress Alexandra tiara alone is valued at £4 million. How did these items come into your possession? Victoria studied the photographs with the detached interest of someone viewing artwork in a gallery. Inspector, I think you'll find that proving ownership of these pieces is far more complicated than your investigation assumes. The provenance of crown jewels is often murky. This wasn't the response Chun had expected. Most suspects either denied everything or broke down immediately when confronted with overwhelming evidence. Victoria seemed to be suggesting something else entirely, that the theft itself might be legally questionable. Are you claiming these items don't belong to the crown estate? I'm claiming, Victoria said carefully, that the current royal family's claim to certain pieces in their collection may not be as ironclad as they've led the public to believe. Some of these jewels have a very complicated history. Chin leaned forward. In her experience, when suspects started making cryptic statements about complicated histories, they were either delusional or sitting on information that could crack a case wide open. Explain. Victoria was quiet for a long moment, seeming to weigh her words with extraordinary care. Inspector, what do you know about the Ashworth family's relationship with the crown? I know your husband is Duke Edmund Ashworth, that your family has served in various ceremonial positions for generations, and that you've had unprecedented access to royal properties and collections. What you don't know, Victoria said, her voice dropping to barely above a whisper, is that my late mother-in-law, Duchess Eleanor Ashworth, was the keeper of certain, inconvenient truths about how some of these treasures originally came to be in royal possession. Chen's instincts sharpened. This sounded like the beginning of a confession, but not the kind she'd anticipated. What kind of truths? The kind that could topple governments, Inspector. The kind that powerful people would kill to keep secret. Victoria's composure finally cracked slightly, and Chen caught a glimpse of genuine fear in her eyes. 3 months ago, Eleanor died in what everyone assumed was a tragic car accident. But, before she died, she entrusted me with documents that tell a very different story about these jewels. What documents? Victoria laughed, but there was no humor in it. Receipts, Inspector. Bills of sale. Insurance documents. Proof that several of the most valuable pieces in the crown collection were never legally acquired by the royal family. They were stolen during the chaos of World War II, when so many wealthy European families lost everything. Chen felt her understanding of the case shifting fundamentally. You're saying these jewels were stolen decades ago? I'm saying these specific pieces belong to Jewish families who were murdered in the Holocaust. When the war ended, instead of being returned to surviving relatives or donated to museums, they somehow found their way into the royal collection. The paperwork Eleanor left me proves that certain members of the royal household knew exactly where these items came from and chose to keep them anyway. The implications hit Chun like a physical blow. If Victoria was telling the truth, then the Crown Estate had been unknowingly displaying stolen Holocaust artifacts for decades. The political and diplomatic ramifications would be catastrophic. So you decided to steal them back? I decided to return them to their rightful owners, Victoria corrected firmly. Eleanor's documents include the names of surviving family members scattered across Europe and America. People who never knew their grandparents' jewelry still existed because it was hidden in plain sight as part of a royal collection. Chen studied Victoria's face, looking for signs of deception. The woman's story was either an elaborate fabrication designed to justify theft, or the most explosive revelation in modern royal history. Why didn't you go through proper legal channels? Why attempt to smuggle them out of the country? Victoria's laugh was bitter now. Inspector, do you honestly believe the royal family would willingly admit to possessing stolen Holocaust artifacts? Do you think they'd simply hand over millions of pounds worth of jewelry because an elderly duchess claimed to have documentation? I tried the proper channels first. I contacted the royal household, presented copies of Eleanor's documents, and was told in no uncertain terms that any further inquiry into this matter would result in charges of blackmail and extortion. So you decided to take matters into your own hands. I decided that some things are more important than laws written to protect the powerful, Victoria said quietly. Those families deserve to know that pieces of their heritage survived. They deserved to hold something their grandparents touched before they were murdered for being Jewish. Chen realized she was no longer dealing with a simple theft case. If Victoria was telling the truth, then the detective was sitting across from someone who had risked everything to correct a historical injustice that had been covered up for decades. But if Victoria was lying, then Chen was being manipulated by one of the most sophisticated con artists she'd ever encountered. The real question was no longer whether Lady Victoria Ashworth was guilty of theft. The question was whether she was a criminal or a hero, and whether the truth she claimed to possess would destroy the monarchy or finally deliver justice to families who had waited 80 years for their heritage to come home. Detective Inspector Chen's hands trembled slightly as she examined the documents Lady Victoria had finally agreed to surrender. Spread across the conference table in New Scotland Yard's secure evidence room were pages that, if authentic, would rewrite decades of royal history and potentially trigger an international diplomatic crisis. The paperwork was extensive and meticulously organized. Duchess Eleanor Ashworth had apparently spent years compiling evidence, working with Holocaust researchers, genealogists, and art recovery specialists to trace the true origins of specific pieces in the Crown collection. Each item was documented with photographs, insurance records from before the war, family testimonies, and detailed provenance reports. The Empress Alexandra tiara, Chen read aloud from one file, originally belonged to the Goldstein family of Vienna. Mordecai Goldstein was a prominent jeweler who created custom pieces for European aristocracy. The family was deported to Auschwitz in 1943. Only one grandchild, Sarah Goldstein Weber, survived and immigrated to Canada after the war. Dr. Rebecca Martinez, the museum authentication expert Chun had called in to verify the documents, looked up from her examination with a grim expression. "Inspector, I've been working in Holocaust art recovery for 15 years. These documents match patterns I've seen in verified cases. The insurance photographs, the family testimonials, even the style of bureaucratic record-keeping. It's all consistent with legitimate wartime documentation." Chen felt the weight of the investigation shifting beneath her feet. What had begun as a straightforward theft case was evolving into something that touched the deepest wounds of 20th century history. "How many pieces are we talking about?" Chen asked. Victoria, who had remained silent while the experts examined her evidence, finally spoke. 17 items currently on display or in storage at the palace. Combined value of approximately £43 million. But the monetary value is irrelevant, Inspector. These pieces represent the final tangible connections that scattered families have to relatives who were murdered. Dr. Martinez nodded gravely. The emotional and historical significance cannot be overstated. For Holocaust survivors and their descendants, recovering family artifacts is often more important than any financial compensation. These items represent memory, identity, and proof that their loved ones existed and mattered. Chen walked to the window, trying to process the implications of what she was learning. Outside, London continued its daily rhythm, completely unaware that the stability of the monarchy might be hanging in the balance. "The question remains," Chen said, turning back to face Victoria. "Why did Duchess Eleanor keep this information secret for so long? Why didn't she expose this years ago?" Victoria's expression grew pained. "Because she was terrified, Inspector. Eleanor came from a generation that understood the absolute power of the monarchy to destroy lives. She witnessed how the royal family dealt with inconvenient truths during the Edward VIII abdication crisis, during the Diana years, during every scandal that threatened the crown's reputation. She knew that going public with this information wouldn't just embarrass the royal family. It would paint them as knowing accomplices to one of history's greatest crimes. So why act now? Why risk everything by entrusting you with this information?" "Because Eleanor was dying," Victoria said simply. "Cancer. She had perhaps 6 months to live, and she couldn't take this secret to her grave. She spent her final weeks training me on the documentation, explaining the legal complexities, and making me promise to ensure these items found their way back to their rightful families." Dr. Martinez looked up from another file. "Inspector, there's something else you need to see. According to these documents, the royal household didn't just acquire these pieces unknowingly. There are communication records suggesting that certain advisors were specifically warned about the questionable provenance of several items and chose to ignore those warnings." Chen felt a chill run down her spine. "You're saying they knew?" "Not necessarily the current royal family," Dr. Martinez clarified, "but members of the household staff and various advisors dating back to the 1950s. People who made conscious decisions to bury inconvenient paperwork rather than investigate the origins of valuable acquisitions. The conference room fell silent as the full scope of the scandal became clear. This wasn't just about stolen jewelry. It was about decades of institutional cover-up, about a monarchy that had built part of its mystique on artifacts taken from Holocaust victims. Chin's phone buzzed with an urgent message from her superior, royal household requesting immediate briefing on Ashworth case. Home Secretary wants updates hourly. Pressure mounting from Downing Street. The political machinery was already mobilizing to contain whatever damage might emerge from Victoria's arrest. Chin realized she was no longer just investigating a crime. She was standing at the center of a potential constitutional crisis. Lady Victoria, Chin said carefully, I need you to understand something. If these documents are authentic, and if your allegations are proven true, the consequences will extend far beyond returning stolen jewelry. You're talking about challenging the legitimacy of the monarchy itself. Victoria met her gaze steadily. Inspector, I've thought about nothing else for months. I've lost sleep, lost weight, and nearly lost my marriage because of the burden Eleanor placed on me. But every time I look at these photographs of families who were murdered, every time I read the testimonies of children who watched their parents being dragged away while clutching these very jewels, I know that some truths are too important to remain buried. Chen nodded slowly, understanding that she was no longer dealing with a simple criminal case. She was dealing with a woman who had chosen to risk everything, her freedom, her reputation, her entire way of life, to correct a historical injustice that had been hidden for nearly 80 years. The question now wasn't whether Lady Victoria Ashworth was guilty of theft. The question was whether she was brave enough to see this through to its conclusion, knowing that the truth she carried could bring down the very institution that had defined British identity for generations. And whether Detective Inspector Chun was prepared to be the one who helped her do it. The emergency meeting at Whitehall felt more like a war council than a standard briefing. Detective Inspector Chen sat at one end of a mahogany table that had witnessed countless government crises, facing an array of officials whose expressions ranged from barely controlled panic to cold calculation. Home Secretary Margaret Thornfield drummed her fingers impatiently on the leather portfolio containing Chen's preliminary report. Beside her, Sir Anthony Blackwood, the Queen's private secretary, maintained the kind of aristocratic composure that suggested he'd been prepared for this moment his entire career. The presence of the Attorney General and representatives from both MI5 and the Foreign Office indicated that the government understood exactly how explosive Victoria's allegations could become. Inspector Chun, the Home Secretary began without preamble. I need you to understand the position we're in. In 6 hours, every major news outlet in the world will be running stories about yesterday's arrest. By tomorrow morning, we'll have Holocaust survivors advocacy groups, international Jewish organizations, and diplomatic representatives from a dozen countries demanding answers. Chen had spent the early morning hours preparing for exactly this conversation. Ma'am, with respect, the political implications don't change the facts. The documentation Lady Victoria provided appears authentic. The historical evidence is compelling. And the legal questions surrounding the Crown Estate's possession of these items are legitimate. Sir Anthony spoke for the first time, his voice carrying the weight of generations of royal service. Inspector, you're dealing with artifacts that have been part of the Crown collection for 70 years. They've been displayed publicly, photographed extensively, and included in official royal functions. The idea that they could simply disappear overnight based on allegations from a woman caught attempting to smuggle them out of the country is what? Chun interrupted, feeling her patience thin. Is inconvenient? Is politically problematic? Sir Anthony, I've spent the last 18 hours reviewing documentation that suggests your office has known about these pieces' questionable origins for decades. The room fell silent. Chen had effectively accused the highest levels of the royal household of complicity in covering up what amounted to the possession of stolen Holocaust artifacts. It was the kind of allegation that could end careers and topple governments. The Attorney General, David Richardson QC, finally broke the tension. Inspector, what exactly is Lady Victoria asking for? What would satisfy her sense of justice while minimizing the diplomatic catastrophe we're potentially facing? Chen consulted her notes, though she'd memorized Victoria's demands hours ago. She wants the artifacts returned to their documented owners or their legal heirs. She wants a public acknowledgement that these items were improperly acquired. And she wants assurance that the Crown Estate will work with international Holocaust recovery organizations to investigate the provenance of other questionable pieces. Absolutely impossible, Sir Anthony declared immediately. The monarchy cannot admit to decades of possessing stolen artifacts. The constitutional implications alone would be devastating. The alternative, Chen replied quietly, is that this story breaks without any royal cooperation, and we spend the next several years in international courts trying to defend the crown's right to keep jewelry stolen from Holocaust victims. Home Secretary Thornfield leaned forward. Inspector, I need you to be very clear about something. Are you recommending that we negotiate with Lady Victoria? Because from where I'm sitting, she committed a serious crime regardless of her motivations. Chen had wrestled with this question throughout the sleepless night. Ma'am, I'm recommending that we treat this as what it actually is, not a simple theft case, but a human rights issue that happens to involve stolen property worth millions of pounds. Lady Victoria didn't steal these items for personal gain. She was attempting to return them to families who've been searching for traces of their murdered relatives for 80 years. The MI5 representative, who had remained silent until now, cleared her throat. Inspector, have you considered the possibility that Lady Victoria might not be acting alone? The sophistication of this operation, the quality of the documentation, the timing, it all suggests resources and connections beyond what one woman could manage. Chen frowned. Are you suggesting this is part of some larger conspiracy? I'm suggesting that someone with Victoria's social connections and access to sensitive information doesn't typically orchestrate complex international smuggling operations without significant support. We need to know who else is involved before we can assess the full scope of what we're dealing with. This thought had occurred to Chun as well, but she'd been so focused on the legitimacy of Victoria's claims that she hadn't fully explored the operational aspects of the case. How had Victoria planned to get the jewelry out of the country? Who was waiting to receive it in Switzerland? How had she intended to locate the documented owners scattered across multiple continents? The Swiss connection bothers me, Chen admitted. Switzerland has some of the world's strongest banking secrecy laws, but they also have extensive experience with Holocaust asset recovery. If Victoria was planning to work through established channels to return these items, then she might have been working with legitimate Holocaust recovery organizations, the Attorney General finished, which would make her prosecution significantly more complicated. Sir Anthony's composure finally cracked. Are you all seriously discussing the possibility of allowing a woman who attempted to steal crown jewels to dictate terms to the British government? The precedent this would set is unthinkable. Chen met his gaze steadily. Sir Anthony, the precedent of continuing to display stolen Holocaust artifacts in the royal collection is also unthinkable. The question isn't whether Lady Victoria committed a crime. She did. The question is whether prosecuting her serves justice or simply protects institutional embarrassment. The room erupted in competing voices, each official trying to balance legal obligations, political realities, and moral imperatives. Through the chaos, Chen's phone buzzed with an urgent message from the detention center. Lady Victoria requesting immediate meeting. Says she has additional information about ongoing security threat to royal family. Chen stood abruptly, silencing the room. Lady Victoria wants another meeting. She claims to have information about a security threat. Home Secretary Thornfield paled. What kind of threat? I don't know, ma'am. But, given everything we've learned in the last 24 hours, I suspect Lady Victoria's story is far from over. As Chen prepared to return to the detention center, she realized that every answer Victoria provided seemed to generate two new questions. The woman sitting in that cell wasn't just a thief with noble motivations. She was the key to a mystery that stretched back 8 decades and potentially threatened the very foundations of the British monarchy. Whatever Victoria was about to reveal, Chun had the sinking feeling that it would transform an already explosive situation into something that could change the course of history itself. Lady Victoria Ashworth looked as though she hadn't slept in days when Detective Inspector Chun returned to the interrogation room. The composed aristocrat who had maintained her dignity through arrest and questioning had been replaced by a woman who appeared to be carrying the weight of terrible knowledge. Inspector, Victoria began without waiting for Chun to sit down. I've been debating whether to tell you this for the past 6 hours. But, after learning that representatives from Whitehall are already trying to bury this investigation, I realize I have no choice. Chun activated the recording device and settled across from Victoria, preparing herself for whatever revelation was coming. What additional information do you have? The jewelry I was carrying wasn't the end of this, Inspector. It was the beginning. Victoria's voice was barely above a whisper. Duchess Eleanor didn't just discover documentation about stolen Holocaust artifacts. she discovered that someone within the royal household has been systematically looting the crown collection for years. The words hit Chun like a physical blow. Someone is stealing from the royal collection? Not stealing for profit, Victoria clarified quickly. Stealing to cover up the Holocaust connection. Eleanor's research identified 43 pieces with questionable provenance. Over the past 5 years, 17 of those pieces have mysteriously disappeared from palace inventories. They've been quietly removed and replaced with high-quality replicas. Chun felt the ground shifting beneath her understanding of the case once again. Replaced by whom? That's what Eleanor was trying to determine when she died, Victoria said grimly. Someone with extraordinary access to the royal collection, someone who understands the documentation systems, and someone with the resources to commission museum-quality forgeries. Eleanor believed she was close to identifying this person when she had her accident. You don't think her death was accidental? Victoria met Chen's gaze steadily. Inspector, Eleanor was one of the most careful drivers I've ever known. She'd been driving the same route to the village church for 30 years. The idea that she would suddenly lose control on a perfectly clear day, on a road she could navigate blindfolded, strikes me as highly suspicious. Chun made rapid notes, her mind racing through the implications. If Victoria was correct, then they weren't just dealing with historical injustices, they were dealing with ongoing criminal activity at the highest levels of the royal household, possibly including murder. Do you have evidence supporting these allegations? Victoria nodded grimly. Eleanor hid backup documentation in 3 different locations. The material I showed you yesterday was just what I could safely transport. There are detailed photographs of the original pieces alongside images of the current replicas on display. The differences are subtle, but they're detectable if you know what to look for. Where are the other documents? One set is hidden in Eleanor's personal library at Ashworth Manor. Another set was placed in a safety deposit box in Edinburgh. The third, Victoria hesitated. The third set was given to someone Eleanor trusted implicitly, someone she believed would ensure the information survived even if something happened to both of us. Chin leaned forward. Who? Professor David Stern at the University of Cambridge. He's one of Europe's leading experts on Holocaust art recovery. Eleanor contacted him months before her death, and he's been quietly verifying her research through international databases and survivor testimonies. Chin realized that Victoria's amateur investigation had apparently evolved into a sophisticated operation involving academic experts and international Holocaust recovery networks. The scope of the conspiracy was far larger than anyone had imagined. Professor Stern has been expecting someone to contact him, Victoria continued. Eleanor gave him specific instructions about what to do if she died under suspicious circumstances. He's been waiting for law enforcement to reach out, and he has documentation that could expose not just the Holocaust artifacts, but the ongoing theft and replacement operation. Chin stood and began pacing, trying to process the full scope of what Victoria was revealing. You're telling me that someone murdered Duchess Eleanor to prevent her from exposing both historical crimes and ongoing criminal activity within the royal household. I'm telling you that Eleanor believed her life was in danger because of what she discovered. She was terrified that her research had attracted the attention of people who would kill to protect their secrets. When she entrusted me with this mission, she made me promise that if anything happened to her, I would ensure the truth came out regardless of the personal cost. Chin stopped pacing and faced Victoria directly. Who do you suspect? Who has the kind of access and resources necessary to orchestrate this cover-up? Victoria was quiet for a long moment, clearly struggling with the weight of her suspicions. Inspector, I can't prove this yet, but Eleanor's final notes suggest she believed the operation involved multiple people working together. Someone with access to the royal collection, someone with connections to international art markets, and someone with enough political influence to suppress investigations. That's a very small group of people. Yes, Victoria agreed quietly. It is. Chin realized they were discussing the possibility that senior members of the royal household, people who had dedicated their lives to serving the crown, were involved in systematic theft and potentially murder to cover up both historical and contemporary crimes. Lady Victoria, I need to ask you something directly. Are you suggesting that yesterday's arrest was anticipated? That someone wanted you to be caught? Victoria's composure finally broke completely. Inspector, I've been asking myself the same question for 24 hours. The timing of the customs inspection, the fact that my usual flight was mysteriously canceled, and I was rerouted through Heathrow instead of a private airfield. It all seems too convenient. Chun felt a chill of recognition. In her experience, When suspects started questioning whether their arrests were coincidental, it usually meant the investigation was more complex than anyone had initially realized. What exactly are you suggesting? I'm suggesting, Victoria said, her voice filled with exhaustion and fear, that I might not be the criminal in this story, Inspector. I might be the scapegoat. Someone who was set up to take the fall, while the Real thieves continue operating under the protection of the very institution I was trying to serve. As Chun prepared to contact Professor Stern and begin what promised to be the most sensitive investigation of her career, she realized that Lady Victoria Ashworth's arrest had uncovered something far more dangerous than stolen jewelry. They had stumbled onto a conspiracy that reached the highest levels of British society, involved the systematic looting of national treasures, and potentially included murder to protect secrets that could bring down the monarchy itself. The woman sitting across from her wasn't just a thief with noble intentions. She was a witness to crimes that spanned 8 decades, and possibly the only person alive who could expose the truth about what had really been happening behind the closed doors of the royal palace. The question now was whether they could uncover that truth before the people responsible realized just how much Victoria actually knew.